So we'll talk about final projects. I know it's a little bit early, but I figured I would get this in your heads so that you guys have plenty of time to think about it, and we'll have plenty of time to work on it for the rest of the semester. But essentially, we're going to be putting everything that we've learned over the semester into practice, into one final project. We've sort of started doing that as we got later into projects, but more specifically into this project. So there's like a goofy concept to this final project. I'll go over it very quickly and then we'll go over the details. So essentially, our final project is that you have recorded an album, record, CD, whatever term you want to use. None of these terms make me feel younger. Anyway, so you've recorded an album as a personal biography. Each track represents a different moment in your life. For advertising purposes, you're going to be picking one single, in air quotes, from your album, and you're going to be releasing that, and it needs a cover image, right? So even though everything is still digital, when we look at any kind of streaming service or platform, there's always still sort of an album cover, square format, thumbnail, whatever you want to call them, but generally a square format, and that sort of goes back to the old record, vinyl album cover things. But we're going to have one for just a single, so you're going to pick one track. You don't necessarily have to have a whole like track listing, but this is just sort of to get the concept rolling in your heads. Where am I? I lost my place. So you're going to create a single encompassing a design representing one time period of your life, so like one track. You get to choose the genre, but it needs to fit with the mood, event, time period. Everything needs to be sort of related to each other. Give the song an original title. Use appropriate typefaces. Generally what that means, we haven't gone over a whole lot of text, but generally what that means is if you're doing, a relatively somber song, you don't want to use, a goofy fun font. You don't want to use a circusy font or Comic Sans if it's something that's darker, unless that's part of the song. But you know what I mean. So basically, it has to relate to the mood, etc. The format's going to be 8.5 by 8.5. You may do this completely digitally. The medium is entirely up to you as long as we're focusing on the concepts that we covered and we learned over the semester. Those will apply to any kind of format, whether you're working physically or digitally, whatever format. Color is color, line is line, etc. All these things that we've been going over. I won't go over the entire list, but these are just some ideas. Some of the things that we've covered over the semester. Think of your line work, geometric shapes, texture, positive, negative space. Again, my favorite thing that I've said all semester, leading the viewer's eye through the piece. All these different things, collage elements if you'd like to, specific typefaces, all that stuff. You're going to also include an artist statement. So in a separate file, it doesn't matter, just some sort of Word file. You can use Word, text edit, whatever program you feel like using. We're essentially going to learn how to write an artist statement as well. Truth be told, I hate writing artist statements, but it's sort of goes along with being an artist. Whether you're a commercial designer or more of a fine art artist, you still need to be able to talk about your work, right? So this is where we're going to start using some of the terminology, some of the things that we've been thinking about and writing about in our quizzes. So that's why I always had like that one sort of last question being a little bit longer of a paragraph answer, so we sort of start to use the terminology. You're going to talk about your ideas and thinking when creating this piece. So the reasons you made the creative choices that you made, color palettes, fonts, etc. A description of the event, the music genre, the names of any fonts used, all that kind of stuff. So you're basically going to talk about what the piece is, why you made the choices that you made, and explaining any technical elements that are in there, like fonts, etc. That's pretty much it. At its core, it's relatively simple. Not so much because obviously it's a larger project. We'll have lots of time to go over this. I'll get into the specifics, but we'll have a check-in point, a couple check-in points. But largely, since we meet twice a week, it's not too bad. I can kind of go around like I usually do and offer suggestions, things like that. So we'll get plenty of feedback. I wanted to make sure I included that as well, so we have lots of time for feedback and things. We'll have a thumbnail, a sheet of thumbnails that'll be due. They can be relatively rough, but basically just so you can, like we always do, kind of formulate some ideas and start to actually block them out a little bit. Moving on, so here's our grading for it. So we have our thumbnails, the overall design, the artist statement, and the presentation. Remember, with all the assignments, but specifically this one, this is presented as a final piece of work, right? Clean, professional, etc. And then I have some samples. I'll show you all of them together. And then I'll go over the specifics of why I chose these examples. So you can see we have 4 different examples of various styles, types, etc. I'll zoom in a little bit so we can see here our Pixies album. Here, a lot of texture, right? A lot of three-dimensionality. We have some of this letterpress numbers here. These would count as typefaces, fonts, etc. Lots of line work. The font and the title is very small on purpose, obviously. They wanted you more to focus on the image, and then just as the Pixies kind of are, they made it a little bit different, a little bit harder to read, a little bit, made the fans work a little bit. But you can see lots of line work, lots of texture in this particular piece. And then we have Radiohead, a little bit more abstract, but lots of use of layering, using this transparency with the type, changing the color of the image. It's roughly the same image, except these spooky, whatever these are, figures are not in it. So you have just the trees in the forest in a negative, so you literally have a positive negative going on with the forest in the background there. But the typesetting obviously is a lot different in this, a little bit more forward. But again, using that sort of overlapping opacity that we were talking about throughout the semester, volume, space, perspective, etc. And then I'll go right to left. This one, again, a lot more texture in the image. This one I show for overall design when we talked about static versus dynamic. This is a little bit more dynamic given that these 2 larger blocks are to the right of the photo or the image. If we had it more even, more balanced, that's not to say it would be a bad thing, but you would have, let's say we took the Pretty Hate Machine, flipped it, put it on the left. You would have an overall balanced design, but it would be a little bit more static. And when I talk about static versus dynamic layouts, I mentioned that a lot throughout the semester. One's not better than the other. It's just going to depend on the kind of image that you're trying to create, right? So when you have a pretty simple image like this, essentially broken down to 2 colors, and then you just have this solid black and white, having a little bit more dynamic layout in this case just gives it a little bit more visual interest rather than having it be perfectly square, perfectly balanced with our symmetrical balance, right? This might not be a spot you would want to use symmetrical balance if you wanted a more stable design, right? So given that this is a very old album at this point, but when this came out, it was really groundbreaking. It was really, really different, and I hadn't heard anything like this before. So given the nature of the music that they create, it's a little bit unsettling. So the sort of dynamic versus static layout here works a lot better to fit with the genre of music. I remember the first time that album came out, the first time I ever heard it, I hated it. I thought it was terrible, and then it took a couple listens, and it was actually really good. Anyway. And then lastly, this one's a little bit more narrative. I'm trying to get that, there we go, I'm trying to get that to go away. Good. This one's a little bit more narrative. You have a lot more font use here. Again, a lot of texture in the font, but in this graphic, you have this sort of like strong linear graphic here, and then you have a lot of texture in the background. And then again, another sort of strong linear graphic frame framing this image of this cavalry riding elephants. Logo, again, on the flag that looks pretty textural. There's a lot of texture within the elephants. So this one is a little bit more, again, it uses a lot of different Elements that we've talked about, texture. This is a relatively balanced design. I wouldn't say, I'd say this is a little bit more symmetrical than asymmetrical. It's really kind of neither. But if you go with, symmetrical and you have your axis point, the overall frame, the overall design is symmetrical, and then you have a little bit of asymmetry going on here, just with the size of the elephant. But roughly, I mean, these are relatively the same size. This kind of, this fourth elephant here kind of balances the size of this elephant. So you have a fairly asymmetrical design within the frame. But given the nature of the frame, they're playing around with this nice asymmetrical balance with a symmetrical balance with the frame. So sort of using these opposing forces to create a more dynamic layout overall. But again, more narrative, a little bit more, I guess, literal with the name of the album. I also choose to show it because it's my favorite band, and I force you guys to look at all the stuff that I like. So those are some examples, a variety of different ideas. There we go. Some similar. Again, when we talked about line work, texture, there's texture in all four of these images. The texture is used very, very differently. The balance is used very differently in all four images, etc. So these are the types of varieties that you can have. It's pretty wide open. For better or for worse, this assignment is creatively wide open. For me, sometimes that gives me a little bit of decision paralysis because I have all the choices I can make, and then usually if I limit myself, it's a little bit easier to make those choices. Final project thumbnails. I can print these out or you can use these digitally. I basically just gave you this sheet so you have something a little bit more tangible. If you choose, in theory, one song, I mean, obviously you're going to choose one song, but for your thumbnails, if you choose to do 9 different versions of one idea, that's totally fine. If you had a couple ideas for like tracks and air quotes that you're going to do, let's say you had 3 potential songs to work with, and you had 3 different ideas. However you want to break up the thumbnails, it's entirely up to you is what I'm trying to say. Thumbnails, yep. And they don't have to be crazy, crazy detailed, but just, again, so that I know that we have some ideas going and I can give you guys a little feedback on what you have. They can be relatively rough, kind of the thumbnails we've been doing generally all semester. But yeah, however you want to do it, as long as there's 9 ideas. And we'll have, like I said, a check-in point for those will be April 26th, so in a couple, next week. And again, they can be relatively rough. I'd like them to be, thought out a bit, but just so, I can hopefully provide some direction. It's really more of sort of a check-in point so I can keep you guys on track and keep myself on track for making sure that everybody has plenty of time to do our final projects. And that's about it. So again, at its heart, it's relatively easy. Sometimes it can feel a little bit harder because, again, creatively, it's super wide open. So we're going to be illustrating a cover for a single that you're going to be releasing about your life. It can be a happy moment. It can be a sad moment. It can be some kind of transition moment. Whatever the moment is, that's entirely up to you. It doesn't have to be deeply personal if you don't want to. I'm not forcing you guys to share anything, deeply personal or talk about stuff you don't want to talk about. So it's entirely up to you. If there is stuff that you do want, whatever. The subject matter is entirely up to you is what I'm trying to say. No judgments, no whatever. You can make it sad, you can make it happy, you can make it whatever you want.